All right, welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to finish off talking about the WAJMA, WAJMMA presidents. That's a little way of remembering the first six presidents, by the way. WAJMMA: Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and Adams is what it stands for. And the M's go in alphabetical order. Madison comes before Monroe, so it's fairly easy to remember. Anyway, so we're going to finish off these first six presidents. We've already covered the first four, so we really only have to cover two today. It shouldn't be terribly long. So the next president after Madison is going to be James Monroe. So James Madison and then James Monroe. Monroe is also from Virginia, like Madison, like Jefferson, and like Washington. So of the first five presidents, four of them were from Virginia. It's sometimes referred to as the Virginia Dynasty. And so 1816, the presidential election year rolls around. Madison has had two terms of office, and following the precedent set by both Washington and Jefferson, his Virginian forebears, he declines to run for a third term of office, doesn't even try. His Secretary of State, James Monroe, will run, and he becomes the Democratic Republican candidate. The Federalists, who are on the verge of collapsing as a party. As a matter of fact, they're really not going to run very many more presidential candidates at all. At least at a national level, they're pretty much done. They run a fellow by the name of Rufus King, who loses badly. It's not the worst beating anyone ever gets. 183 to 34, however, is a pretty serious beating. And so, why did Madison win? Monroe win so handily? First of all, the successful conclusion of the War of 1812 helped the Republicans. That's the Democratic Republicans. They've added Indiana as a new state in 1816, and so now there's a few more electoral votes. It's a Western state, and the West is very in favor of the Democratic Republicans because they're pushing for things that are helping the West. And finally, really, the Democratic Republicans in Madison is sort of the start of this, really, had started to adopt some of the programs that the Federalists had been asking for. Federalists liked the national bank. Madison supported that idea. Federalists wanted more tariffs. Madison supported that idea. So that gives the Federalists nothing to really campaign against uh, Madison and Monroe on. Monroe follows along in Madison's footsteps. And so they don't really have anything to say, well, this is how we'll do things differently and better, because there's not much there. And so, because of this sort of co opting of the Federalist talking points, partly because of a complacency that Americans are feeling, they're pretty happy with themselves. They feel pretty satisfied with the way things are going. We enter an era known as the era of good feelings, which is going to be the end of the first party system as the Federalist Party goes away. And for a period, we will have essentially at the national level only one real political party, and that's the Democratic Republicans. It will later splinter, but for a couple of decades, really, there's basically only one solid political party on the national level. And part of the thing that characterizes this period is we become isolationist once again. We basically just ignore what's going on over in Europe and Asia and Africa and places like that, and instead begin to concentrate on developing our own nation. We've got a long way to go. I mean, the western border has been expanded out to the Rockies, but if you get past the Mississippi, there's virtually no white settlement. There's a little bit, but there's almost none. And so we have huge amounts of land to farm and to go taking timber and finding minerals and all of these things to develop. And that's on the agenda now, not dealing with what's going on in Europe. And so we have a virtual one-party state. Um, The Democratic Republicans hold virtually every elected office, most of the appointed ones as well. There are some Federalist judges left over from Adams's term in office, but by this point, most of them have gotten old, died, or retired, and so even that is tailing off. The era doesn't last terribly long, really a decade, a bit more, really. Um, it's kind of a lull in political clashes, as your notes will say here, but uh, there's no strong issues during this relatively short period that are going to be divisive, and that's really a good thing for America at the time because we needed to work together more. I'd love to see that sort of thing happen again, but we've we've really got uh, a different sort of viewpoint towards things now. But so it's kind of hard to understand, get what was going on. But so we just really were needing to concentrate on ourselves and expansion and growth. And so a lot of the things, and pretty much everybody supported that idea. So a lot of the things that would have caused difficulties are pretty much just uh, not there. Not surprisingly, since he had been Madison's Secretary of State for years, Monroe's strong point is foreign policy. That's what he's really best at dealing with. And during his term of office, he's going to make a lot of moves dealing with foreign nations. Now, the people of America are concentrating on, like I said a moment ago, development of America. What Monroe is doing is essentially trying to hold everybody else at bay so that we can do that. We're going to obtain Florida from Spain during Monroe's terms of office. We're going to regularize the borders of the Louisiana Purchase, including the Oregon country. That gets rid of a source of conflict with the United States and Britain. We will recognize several Latin American nations' independence during his terms of office, and we will issue the Monroe Doctrine. And that's a really important thing. That goes on for a very long time. As a matter of fact, it is still a cornerstone of American foreign policy. And so we'll discuss that in more detail. Well, we'll discuss all of these things in a bit more detail. The Adams-Onis Treaty. Basically, what this is a treaty between the United States and Spain in which we buy Florida from Spain. And the issue is that relationships between the United States and Spain have been getting worse and worse over the years as issues with Florida's control of Spain become more and more of a problem. You see, the Spanish really didn't do much with Florida. And yet, our troops, our forces, our people could not legally cross into Florida. So it became sort of a haven for troublemakers to escape to. And by troublemakers, we're talking outlaws, escaped slaves, and unfriendly natives, particularly the Seminole Indians of Florida. So what would happen is they would come up and raid into Georgia and things, and then retreat back to Florida, and we couldn't do anything about it. Well, in 1818, Andrew Jackson had, without permission, invaded Florida to raid the Seminoles and the escaped slaves who had been harassing Georgia. In doing so, he will also capture a couple of Spanish forts. During those captures, he will actually execute a couple of people. He gets an order from the president saying immediately to not invade Florida. He's already done it, and so what he does is he responds with a message essentially saying, "Shall I give it back?" Um, so here we have this problem. We've basically committed an act of war. We don't really want a war with Spain. Spain doesn't want a war with us. And so we work it out diplomatically. And the Secretary of State for the United States at the time was John Quincy Adams, the son of former President John Adams, and he meets with the Spanish minister, foreign minister, a fellow by the name of Don Luis de Onís. They meet in Washington, D.C., and they reach an agreement in 1819. And in this agreement, Spain says, you may have Florida. They cede, is the term, C-E-D-E, cede Florida to the United States. In return, we will pay $5 million to Spain for damages caused by rebellious settlers that had been there, sort of illegal squatter types, and for the actions of Jackson. We also define the western limits of the Louisiana Purchase in this treaty, particularly where the border between Louisiana and Texas is, and we recognize specifically Spain's sovereignty over Texas. Now, that's going to be an issue in the not too distant future, but at the moment, for the moment, we say yes, no, Spain, Texas is yours. Texas is yours, Spain. Many Americans wondered, why on earth were we buying Florida? It was a place of swamps and mosquitoes and alligators and not terribly friendly natives. There was a reason why the Spanish didn't have much control over it. They didn't have many people there. Nobody wanted it. Congressman John Randolph of Virginia would say, Florida, sir, is not worth buying. It is a land of swamps, of quagmires, of frogs and alligators and mosquitoes. A man, sir, would not immigrate into Florida. No, sir, no man would immigrate into Florida. My guess is that Mr. Randolph was not a retired jeweler from New York City. Okay, by the early 1800s, we started to have a problem with Oregon. Oregon was not really an organized area, part of the United States or anything. We did lay a claim to it based on the Lewis and Clark expedition, but other countries claimed it too. Russia laid a claim to it because some of their ships came down the coast from Alaska and would trade there. The British had some trade missions going on there as well, and the Spanish claim it as part of sort of a northern California. There you see it on the map. It's in the northwestern part of the present-day United States. The value for it lay primarily for most people in the fur trade there. There were many seals in the area, and seal fur was quite valuable. So there was a lot of profit to be made there. There was also it served as a stopping point for ships that were whaling over in the Pacific Ocean, a place where they could come and get fresh water and food and things without having to come all the way back over around to New England, which is where many of those ships were from. But also there were beginning to be lots of American farmers settling there. The land there is incredibly fertile, and so word had started to get out after the Lewis and Clark expedition that this place was a wonderful place to farm. And since nobody really owned the land, you could basically go out there and just grab it. And so some, both Americans and British had been doing that. So in 1818, what happens is the United States and Britain agree to jointly occupy Oregon, allowing citizens of both countries to settle there. Now that doesn't really settle the issue. It doesn't really go too well. And eventually we will almost go to war with Britain over it before we settle on a new boundary with them. Spain and Russia get totally frozen out of this agreement. And for the next several decades, American and British settlers began to pour into Oregon. really one of the longest lasting foreign affairs issues that Monroe is going to face is, or is going to deal with. He didn't really face it. It wasn't like there was a major crisis involved in this. But in 1823, Monroe will make a presidential address to Congress, and in it he will lay out what becomes known as the Monroe Doctrine. And while it was written out by John Quincy Adams, who was good at foreign affairs, he was Secretary of State after all, and had grown up in diplomatic circles. I mean, as a young boy, when his father was our ambassador to Great Britain, he had gone along with him as a child and had seen firsthand how that worked. He had been to France with his father during the American Revolution, trying to drum up support and things. So he had always been around this sort of thing. So he had a few advantages there. Anyway, so what Adams writes and what Monroe says is essentially 2 points: that European countries are no longer allowed to colonize in the Western Hemisphere. This is our backyard, it is our sandbox, it's our neighborhood, and no one else is welcome to play in it any longer. And if they did so, we would consider that an act of war against the United States, meaning that if you came over and started a new colony, we might declare war on you for it. In return, the U.S. promises to stay out of the affairs of Europe, particularly in their efforts to carve up Africa and Asia into colonies. We say, look, we don't care what y'all do over there, but over here is our backyard. This is our neighborhood, and you're not allowed to play in it. The United States, interestingly enough, could not have enforced such a rule at that time. Okay, we had a small navy. It wasn't bad navy, but it was very small. We had virtually no army. We really would have had a hard time backing this up. But we have the support of the British. And the reason we have the support of the British in this is it's not so much that they're friendly to the United States. They weren't. We still had our issues between the United States and Britain at the time. We weren't the good friends that we are now. And we are very good friends with the British. They are by far our closest allies. But as the British didn't want to see other European countries coming in or coming back in to the Western Hemisphere, because while they were gone, while, say, Mexico, which had become independent in 1821, was an independent nation and not a part of Spain, the British could do business there. The British could trade there without any restrictions from the Spanish. And that's what the British want. They want access to those markets. They want to make money off of this deal. And so they agree that no one should be allowed to establish new colonies in the Western Hemisphere. And they are willing to back that up with their navy. Now, their navy is the largest, most powerful one in the world. Britain is one of the wealthiest countries in the world, if not the wealthiest country in the world at the time. So when they back it up, it's going to stick. Of course, nowadays, the U.S. is a superpower, and we back it up ourselves. But it's important because this is not a one-time thing. This has continued, this idea, this belief has continued on to the present day. If other countries, if European countries, or African or Asian countries for that matter, begin to meddle in the affairs of Latin America, the Caribbean, South America, the United States takes a very, very dim view of that. And we do everything we can to discourage it. Not always successfully, in the case of, say, Cuba and Venezuela, but usually pretty darn well. And we've resorted to some dirty tricks before and everything. And now, that doesn't mean that the United States doesn't meddle all we want. It's certainly a one-way street. But the Monroe Doctrine in its later editions, like the Roosevelt Corollary, which we talk about in 1302, are still definitely important parts of American policy even today. And so it's something really kind of important to understand. And here we have a really great political cartoon of the Monroe Doctrine. This was printed in a British magazine, a British publication. And we have the United States as the big chicken up in the front to the big rooster marching about all proud like and everything. And in the European coop, he has bottled up Russia and France and Germany and Italy and England behind the Monroe Doctrine. And running around happy and free are all of the little chicks, all the little baby chickens. Argentine Republic, Guatemala, Brazil, Chile, Paraguay, all of those. You'll notice two slightly bigger chickens, roosters that look like they're about to fight. That's Colombia and Venezuela because, well, Colombia and Venezuela were on the verge of having a war with each other. And so that's what this cartoon is all about, is about locking up the hemisphere for us to dominate and keeping the others bottled up in Europe. Very subtle, as most political cartoons are. Right. All right. One last thing I want to talk about the Monroe administration years was a Supreme Court case called McCulloch versus Maryland, and it's an argument over the right of the state to tax a national institution. Basically, the state of Maryland wanted to tax the Second Bank of the United States as they were taxing other banks in Maryland. The Supreme goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court rules that the bank was itself a necessary and proper thing for the control of the national currency, and therefore it was a constitutional question. All of that is thanks to that elastic clause I mentioned a while back, that it says that Congress can pass laws necessary and proper, that it is therefore a constitutional thing. And they further ruled that states do not have the authority to tax what amounts to a branch of the national government. That would be subordinating the national government to the state governments, because then the state governments just tax the national government stuff as much as they wanted and basically put their controls on to the national government. And so they say, the Supreme Court that is, says that you can't do that, that is not legal. And what we're doing is we're further developing the concept of national supremacy and loose interpretation of the Constitution, because it supports the idea that states don't get to control national functions, national business, well, it's not businesses, but national government resources, and that, so that's the supremacy part, and that it was absolutely okay for the bank to be created, constitutionally speaking, because of the necessary and proper clause, and so it reiterates that loose interpretation of the Constitution. Okay, moving on to the last of the Wajma, the last of the first 6 presidents, the last of the early Republic presidents. We're going to have John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, and the last of the so-called notable presidents. Now, the notables were people who were from wealthy, well-known, established, politically connected families. The Adamses, the Washingtons, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. All of these men were wealthy, educated, good families, generational thing of histories of service to the nation. John Quincy Adams is the same way. He's got the same thing his father has going for him. Plus, his dad was president of the United States once. And he'd just been Secretary of State. So we've got all of these things working in their favor. And so because they're from these prominent, well-to-do families, they have certain attitudes and ways of looking at the world. And the term for these sort of prominent families was notable, not noble, Nobility is not legal in the United States. You may not have a title of nobility as an American citizen without specific permission from Congress. But anyway, it's still a sort of unofficial aristocracy that has developed here in the United States, and it's based largely on money and political influence. And so Monroe serves his 2 terms, follows the same precedent that Madison and Jefferson and Washington had before, and steps down. He declines to run again. And this ends the so-called Virginia dynasty. What we're doing is creating a free-for-all situation. There's really only one political party, Democratic Republicans. The Federalists have faded away. So what we're talking about is people from different factions within the party running against one another. And many of the 5 of them, prominent ones, will run for president of the United States. John Quincy Adams runs. He's from Massachusetts. He was Monroe's Secretary of State. John C. Calhoun from South Carolina was the Secretary of War. William H. Crawford from Georgia was the Secretary of the Treasury, and a pretty popular fellow. Henry Clay of Kentucky was Speaker of the House. He'd been in the House of Representatives for several years at this time, had a lot of authority there, but wanted to be president. He'll run actually more than once. And the last is Andrew Jackson from Tennessee. Now, Kentucky and Tennessee, both Western states. Georgia and South Carolina, of course, both Southern. And Adams is from Massachusetts, a New England state, a northern state. So Calhoun will drop out of the race and decide to push for being elected vice president, getting that vice presidential seat. Crawford will suffer a stroke during the election campaigns, and he actually dies not long after the election. But he's eliminated essentially as a result of his health. Although he did still appear on some ballots, and he still got some electoral votes. So that's sort of the field that's running in this election. And here we go. We see the results. If you look at the electoral vote total, in the green, 38% of the electoral vote in the 1824 election went to Thomas Jackson. 32% went to John Quincy Adams, 16% to Crawford, and 14% to Clay. Again, Calhoun has dropped out. He's really running for vice president. In the popular vote, the difference is even greater. Jackson has 43% of the popular vote, whereas Adams has only 31%, with Crawford and Clay each getting 13%. Each of them wins some electoral votes. Okay. Scattered all around. You'll notice that, for example, Jackson does well in the South and in the West, but he also picks up some northern states, some more northerly states. Adams does very well up in New England, and picks up a few others out in the West. It's not as popular out there as he was, but he's got the big population centers. He's got New York City. He's got Boston. Those both went for Adams. But you'll see that nobody has received a majority. Nobody has exceeded 50% exactly. And so, just like in the election of 1800, no one candidate has the required majority of electoral votes. And so the procedure is that it goes to the House of Representatives to be voted for. And so they vote. Under the 12th Amendment, the top 3 candidates are going to be voted on by the House of Representatives. Henry Clay is therefore out of the running. He was in 4th place. So he uses his influence as Speaker of the House to push votes towards John Quincy Adams. And he does this because although Jackson is a Westerner, he is not a fan or a supporter of Henry Clay's big political baby. The thing he wants to get done is a program of improvements known as the American System, and Jackson's opposed to spending the money on it. Adams is willing to do that. And so Henry Clay helps Adams to get elected. Also, the other thing is Jackson. He scared people. He was kind of a scary guy. He was tall and thin and intimidating. He kind of had a harsh look on his face most of the time. He was known to be a whiskey drinker. He didn't drink wine, he drank whiskey. He was a brawler. He had been in several duels in his life. He was raised from very severe poverty. He came up from severe poverty to become a wealthy and influential man, partly through a fortunate marriage, partly through his military abilities. And that's never forget how important that is in getting a man elected president in this country. Um, so he was rough around the edges. He wasn't the same kind of guy that everybody was used to, and Adams was. Adams was a notable to the core. He was predictable. They kind of felt more comfortable with him. So Adams will win. In return, he makes Clay his Secretary of State. Now that's a big deal because at the time, if you look at it, you see that many of the former secretaries of state became president later on. Uh, Adams had been Monroe's Secretary of State. Monroe had been Madison's Secretary of State. Madison had been Jefferson's Secretary of State. And Jefferson had been Washington's Secretary of State. So of the first 6 presidents, 4 of them were former secretaries of state. So it's a very good likelihood, and Clay would like to be president one day, that if he's made Secretary of State, he will one day become president. Jackson and his supporters are furious about this. They claim that Henry Clay has abused his power, his position as Speaker of the House. Excuse me. And they accuse him of selling the election to Adams in return for the job as Secretary of State. And they claim that a corrupt bargain has been made. Calhoun would label the supposed deal a corrupt bargain. And they're going to remember this. And for the next 4 years, they're going to talk about it nonstop. All right. So, what did Adams do during his presidency? Well, one of the big things he tried to do was to improve conditions across the United States. In part, that meant endorsing Henry Clay's pet project, the American System. Now, the American System we'll talk about a little bit more in detail in a minute, but it was not real popular in the South because one of the things that it wanted to do was to charge protective tariffs in order to pay for its improvements, and so that was not popular in the South. Adams's policies were often opposed by Jackson's supporters, simply because they were mad at him for, as they saw it, stealing the election, but also by Jeffersonian type Democratic Republicans because they saw him as going far too far. Remember that the original Jeffersonians were into strict interpretation of the Constitution, and Adams is getting pretty fast and loose with his interpretation of what he's allowed to do with the Constitution. And all of this basically is going to lead to an end to the era of good feelings and the rise of the second party system in America, not long after Adams's presidency ends. Another thing that gets hung on him, although it's a bit unfair, is the Tariff of Abominations, the Tariff of 1828. It's passed in the last year of his presidency. He actually tried to veto it. He didn't like it. It's the highest tariff that the United States had ever seen before. To that point, it's a protective tariff. And they severely increased tariffs on raw materials, textiles, and iron tools and other goods being brought into the United States. Well, what happens is protective tariffs are typically retaliated upon. And so other nations, like Britain in particular, retaliate with protective tariffs of their own on Southern imported agricultural products like, cotton and tobacco and things like that. And so that's really going to hurt the Southern economy. The South hated it and blamed Adams for it, even though it had to be passed over his veto. And that's what happened was he tried to veto it and got passed over his veto. Adams was odd in that when he made deals with the Native Americans, he actually intended to live up to them. I know, gasp, that's a shocking concept. But when he made these deals, he intended to live up to them. Now, his successors did not necessarily. And he was not real popular personally. He was not a warm, friendly, charming sort of fellow, really. He was totally unnotable to the core, right? He was aloof. He was self-righteous. He was paternalistic. He believed himself to be of a better class than the common man, and that doesn't play well with the common man who is the people that are going to elect you. If they feel like you're talking down to them a lot all the time, they tend to resent that. People don't like that. He actually chastised Congress. He went in front of Congress and gave a speech in which he chastises them for being too concerned with their constituents' demands. He says, now then, you people should be more like statesmen and think about what's good for the nation, and you're just a bunch of vote-grubbing fools and things. That does not play well with Congress. These are powerful men of authority, and they don't like being told that they are essentially just power hungry and not doing what was best for the country. He also refused to use the system of patronage, which, to be honest, was quite commonly used to buy, as he saw it, supporters in the election of 1828. And as a result, So the American system, as mentioned previously, basically this is an idea to improve the national economy, especially to benefit the new western states like Kentucky and Tennessee and Ohio and Indiana and Missouri and Arkansas, all of those guys. It essentially consists of three elements. It's proposed by Henry Clay, who's a senator or a congressman from Kentucky. It was supported by Adams and later on by the new political party, the Whigs. It was disliked by Jackson and most of the Democratic Republicans, and certainly by the South. And anyway, it consisted of three elements. The first was a protective tariff to stimulate manufacturing and provide money, to provide income. This was popular in the North because that's where the manufacturing was taking place. And so it would help their industries. It was popular in the West because it would help pay for the other things that they want, but it was not popular in the South. They neither wanted the infrastructure to be built up, nor did they want to pay additional taxes. Federally subsidized roads. This is the second part, improving the infrastructure of the nation, subsidizing roads and canals to facilitate commerce. These were ways of improving access to markets, particularly helpful for those Western farmers again. They need to be able to get their products to a marketplace where they can be sold quickly. Some of these things have a time period, a shelf life, after which they'll be no good. They'll be unsellable, and so they won't be able to make any money with it. This was a very popular concept in the West. Not in the South. Again, the South didn't feel like they needed these improvements. Most of them would have taken place in the West, particularly in what was called the Old Northwest, Ohio, Indiana, all up in there, and connecting them out, not really helping the South. The South doesn't want to pay for that as a result. And third, a national bank to control credit, provide loans, and provide a uniform currency. You see, at the time, each state, heck, each bank could print its own paper money. Paper money wasn't really considered money. Paper money was essentially a promissory note, a promise to pay with what was considered real money, and that was gold and silver coins. So anybody at the time could print up paper money, and local banks did it, and state banks did it. The national government did it as well. The National Bank did so as well. The problem is, of course, with how useful a dollar bill from the Santa Fe, Texas Bank and Trust would be if I went to New York City. Would they even accept it? Probably not. Now, a Texas State Bank note might be more acceptable because it's something that people would probably at least have heard of, but they still might not accept it, or they might accept it but say, okay, we'll take it, but because it's going to be a hassle to get the real money for this, instead of giving you $1 worth of product for it, we're only going to give you 75 cents worth of product for it. And the other 25%, that's just going to be the cost to you of us accepting this bill. And so having a national currency eliminates that. It would greatly facilitate commerce between the states. And that was popular. That was about the only part of the American system that was probably popular across the whole country, is this concept of a uniform currency. But the South doesn't like the idea of a national bank because they don't think they're going to benefit from it. They believe that by putting all the money, the government's money into this one bank, it's going to create this monolithically powerful organization, and it does create a pretty darn powerful organization that's going to control all of the credit and loans and money supply, and that's not going to help the South. They believe that's going to be harmful to their economy. Both the North and the West like this idea. The Westerners like it because they want those loans and they want that uniform currency. They want loans to buy more land and to buy equipment to put it into cultivation. The North wants those loans in order to build more factories and be able to provide more product, to create more product that they can sell. So they're all in favor of it, but not the South. So there's a lot of heel dragging on the South's part against the American system. And when Adams comes out in strong support of it, it means that the South is really pretty much not going to vote for him. All right. Gibbons versus Ogden. Again, we've got the Marshall Court. We call Supreme Courts, typically we discuss them by using the last name of the sitting Chief Justice because they sort of set the tone of the court. And so this is the Marshall Court still a Federalist court. Marshall's been sitting on this bench for quite a while. And once again, in John Quincy Adams's term of office, they're going to get involved in a serious case of importance to, again, showcase the dominance of national authority over the states. And in the case of Gibbons versus Ogden, what happens is a New York law gives a monopoly on steamboat service across the Hudson River between New Jersey and New York City to a man named Aaron Ogden. Now, because it's crossing from the state of New Jersey into New York City, which is in, guess which state? That's right, New York. That makes it interstate trade. Interstate trade is specifically under the Constitution to be regulated by Congress, by the national government, not the states. And so a rival, Thomas Gibbons, sues the state and Ogden, saying you can't give him a monopoly. You can't say I can't do this and only allow him to do it because that's restricting interstate trade and the state can't do it. And the Supreme Court sides with him because, well, they should have. They say that Gibbons's federal license, Gibbons had obtained a federal license to operate a ferry service there, would supersede the state of New York's authority to control who came in and out of New York. And so, again, this is a case of the national government saying, look, we're the ones in charge, not the states. If there's a conflict between the two, the national government is supreme. And that's an argument that is going to continue. Heck, it still continues over certain issues. Okay, and that's going to be it for our discussion of Chapter 7. Of course, if you have any questions, right now it's Monday, Wednesday, Thursday from 1 to 2 o'clock on Discord. You can access Discord from your cell phone or from a laptop or an iPad or whatever. And I'm live on there 3 days a week for an hour. I just kind of hang out and shoot the bull until somebody comes in and asks questions. But anyway, feel free to join and ask any questions that you have then. Or, of course, you can email me at jwomack2@com.edu, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. You'll need to read Chapter 8. There'll be a video for that coming up in just a couple of days. And watch out for quizzes over Chapter 7, Chapter 8, and we'll eventually have our next test. I'm looking at the schedule, the new revised schedule, which has been posted to Blackboard, shows the COVID schedule says that our exam will be on Monday, April 6th. Now, if we are still in a shelter-in-place situation, if the campus is still closed at that point, and I don't know if it's going to be or not, but it may, then we will take that online. It will essentially be a longer version of the quizzes that you're used to taking online. If they have reopened campus, and hopefully they'll make lots of announcements and things, it will be on campus, and you will need to bring a Scantron for that. But hopefully we will have a little bit of notice to make that a little bit easier to do. At any rate, that's it for this session, and we'll talk to you again soon.